He stood in an outdated suit, surrounded by the elite who mercilessly mocked his broken marriage, ready to slip out the side door. But then, the grand mahogany doors crashed open. The city's most elusive billionaire CEO stormed in, locked eyes with the humiliated single dad, and shouted, "Look at me!" Thomas Harding sat at his small, scarred kitchen table, staring at the thick, cream-colored envelope as if it contained a live explosive. The gold foil lettering on the front caught the dim light of the overhead pendant lamp, a glaring reminder of a world he no longer belonged to. It was an invitation to the social event of the season, the wedding of his former best friend David to Jessica, the younger sister of Thomas's ex-wife. For the past 3 years, Thomas had lived a quiet, rigorously scheduled life as a single father. His world began and ended with his 6-year-old daughter, Chloe. Ever since Sarah had walked out on them, citing Thomas's lack of ambition and stifling predictability, Thomas had poured every ounce of his soul into making sure Chloe never felt the void her mother left behind. He worked a steady, unglamorous job as a mid-level structural engineer, earning just enough to keep their modest heritage home in Weston, Massachusetts. The house was Thomas's last remaining tether to his past. It was a charming, slightly run-down craftsman bungalow that sat awkwardly at the edge of a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. While developers had swept through the area, bulldozing old homes to build sprawling modern mansions, Thomas had stubbornly held on. This stubbornness meant his modest backyard now shared a towering wrought iron property line with a $15 million modern fortress. That fortress belonged to Evelyn Hastings. At 32, Evelyn was a phantom in the neighborhood, but a titan everywhere else. She was the founder and CEO of Hastings Global, a ruthless venture capital and tech acquisition firm that dominated the financial news cycles. Thomas had only seen her a handful of times, usually stepping out of a sleek, black chauffeured SUV, flanked by quiet security personnel, her face obscured by oversized designer sunglasses, dressed in impeccably tailored blazers that cost more than Thomas's car. She was icy, untouchable, and entirely detached from the suburban mundanity that surrounded her estate. Thomas dragged a heavy hand down his tired face, pulling his attention back to the invitation. He didn't want to go. The very thought of stepping into the Fairmont Copley Plaza, surrounded by the wealthy, backslapping crowd that had eagerly absorbed Sarah after the divorce, made his chest tighten with anxiety. Sarah would be there, of course, and she wouldn't be alone. She would be draped on the arm of Preston Croft, the hyper-aggressive hedge fund manager she had left Thomas for. Preston was everything Thomas was not. Loud, immensely wealthy, socially connected, and brutally condescending. "Daddy, are you okay?" Thomas blinked, shaking off the dark cloud of his thoughts. Chloe stood in the kitchen doorway, clutching her favorite worn-out stuffed rabbit. She wore oversized pink pajamas, her messy brown hair falling into her eyes that looked exactly like his own. "I'm perfectly fine, Bug," Thomas said, forcing a warm, easy smile, as he quickly flipped the invitation face down on the table. He opened his arms, and Chloe ran into them, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Just thinking about what we should make for breakfast. Pancakes or waffles?" "Waffles!" Chloe cheered, the worry vanishing from her face instantly. "With the smiley face berries." "You got it," Thomas chuckled, lifting her up and setting her on the counter away from the stove. As he moved through the familiar, comforting motions of mixing batter and slicing strawberries, the knot in his stomach loosened slightly. This was his reality. This was what mattered. But later that night, after Chloe was safely tucked into bed and the house was draped in heavy silence, the anxiety returned. Thomas stood by the kitchen window, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey, looking out into the darkness of his backyard. Beyond his wooden fence rose the immaculate, heavily manicured grounds of Evelyn Hastings' estate. Soft, architectural lighting illuminated the ancient oak trees she had imported, and the faint blue glow of a massive infinity pool shimmered in the distance. He took a sip of the burning liquid, his mind replaying the phone call he had received from David 2 days prior. "Tommy, you have to come," David had pleaded, his voice thick with guilt. "I know it's awkward with Sarah and Preston being in the wedding party, but you're my oldest friend. I can't get married without you there. please, just for the ceremony and dinner. I've put you at a table far away from them." Thomas had reluctantly agreed, cornered by a decade of loyalty to a man who had, admittedly, stood by him during the darkest days of the divorce. But agreeing to go and actually surviving the night were two entirely different things. Going alone meant walking into a firing squad of pitying glances and whispered gossip. "Look at poor Thomas, left in the dust, couldn't keep his wife, hasn't moved on." He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window, dreading the impending humiliation. As he stared out, a sudden movement on the other side of his fence caught his eye. A figure was walking along the edge of the Hastings property. It was Evelyn. She was wrapped in a long, dark cashmere coat against the crisp autumn air, a stark contrast to her usual heavily armored corporate attire. She was walking a massive, sleek Doberman Pinscher. For a brief second, she paused near the boundary line. Thomas held his breath, feeling entirely exposed in his lit kitchen. But her gaze didn't meet his. She simply looked up at the stars, a rare moment of stillness for a woman who supposedly never stopped moving, before disappearing back into the shadows of her estate. Thomas turned away from the window, the whiskey suddenly tasting bitter. He was a ghost in his own life, a single father struggling to keep his head above water, about to walk into a room specifically designed to remind him of everything he had lost. Saturday arrived with the relentless, inevitably, of a ticking clock. The wedding was scheduled for 5 o'clock in the evening, leaving Thomas the entire day to marinate in his dread. He had arranged for Mrs. Gable, a trusted retired neighbor from down the street, to watch Chloe overnight. By 3 o'clock, the house was quiet again. Thomas stood in his cramped bedroom, staring at himself in the full-length mirror attached to the back of his closet door. The reflection staring back at him was deeply uninspiring. He was wearing his only suit, a charcoal two-piece he had purchased nearly 8 years ago for his own wedding. Over the years, he had lost weight from the stress of the divorce and the constant running around of single parenthood. The jacket hung loosely off his shoulders, and the trousers pooled slightly at the ankles. The fabric had lost its crispness, looking dull and tired, much like the man wearing it. He fumbled with a dark blue tie, his hands shaking slightly, failing for the third time to get the knot right. "Pathetic," he muttered to himself, tearing the tie loose with a frustrated sigh. Seeking a moment of fresh air to calm his racing heart, Thomas abandoned the tie on his bed and walked out through the kitchen to the back patio. The late afternoon air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. He leaned heavily against the wooden railing of his deck, closing his eyes and practicing the deep breathing exercises Chloe's pediatrician had once recommended for childhood tantrums. A sudden, sharp bark shattered the quiet. Thomas's eyes snapped open. Standing squarely in the middle of his small, slightly overgrown lawn was Evelyn Hastings's massive Doberman. The dog had somehow bypassed the electronic security perimeter and squeezed through a loose board in Thomas's old wooden fence. The dog wasn't growling. Instead, it was intensely sniffing a forgotten plastic toy truck Chloe had left in the grass. "Hey, buddy," Thomas said softly, staying perfectly still. He knew better than to make sudden movements around a guard dog. "You're a long way from the penthouse." Before Thomas could figure out how to safely return the animal, a voice cut through the air, crisp, authoritative, and smooth as polished glass. "Duke, heel." Thomas looked up to see Evelyn Hastings standing at the gap in the fence. The billionaire CEO was a striking vision, utterly out of place in the messy reality of Thomas's backyard. She was dressed in what Thomas could only assume was weekend casual for the ultra-rich. A pair of immaculately tailored wide-leg trousers, a silk cream blouse left undone at the collar, and an oversized beige